Ladies and gentlemen, our program will now begin. So please welcome the CEO of the Churchill Club, Karen Tucker.
Hello. Good evening. Thank you so much. Very, very kind. My name is Karen Tucker. I'm CEO of the Churchill Club. For those of you who aren't yet familiar, we are an independent nonprofit operating here in the Bay Area since 1985 with the mission to encourage innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. And we convene topics regularly that we believe are ripe for opportunity around those three things. And tonight we are here to ponder the notion of connecting everything while everything is in motion. The new age of data is all about making new, meaningful connections, often with never-before-seen data. And while this new normal promises to create tremendous value, delivering on the promise is massively non-trivial. So here to weigh in on creating the best outcomes are two distinguished chief data scientists. We have Anthony Scriffignano of Dun & Bradstreet, who is making his second Churchill Club appearance by popular demand, and Inderpal Bhandari of IBM. First, some thanks are in order, actually, especially to Anthony and the Dun & Bradstreet team, whose intellectual contributions and support made this program possible to begin with. And then also to Citrix Systems, our partner and host. Citrix has an especially strong connection to this topic. They are creating a digital workspace where people, organizations, and things are connected to improve collaboration, reduce costs, provide better productivity for people at work. And Citrix calls this workspace IoT. I'm pleased to introduce to you the man who is responsible for leading the team that's defining the strategy in this regard for Citrix, and his name is Steve Wilson. Please welcome Steve, who will introduce our speakers.
All right. Hey, thanks, Karen. So first, I'd like to thank the Churchill Club. Churchill Club's a great organization in terms of putting together this kind of business-to-business networking. So Citrix is really proud to be a supporter, and I'm glad to be here tonight. We have two really distinguished speakers tonight. First, we have Inderpal Bhandari, who's the Chief Data Officer at IBM. It's actually a newly created role at IBM, and Inderpal is implying his 20 years of industry experience, his PhD from CMU, and his vision of what could be for the data strategy at IBM. We also have Anthony Scriffignano, who is the SVP and Chief Data Scientist at Dun & Bradstreet. He's an internationally recognized data scientist, has 35 years of experience in the field, and has a master's in computer science, a PhD in leadership and change, and an MBA from Columbia University. Should be a really thought-provoking conversation, and so please welcome Anthony and Inderpal to the stage.
Thank you very much. Always kind of hate hearing people introduce me. I'm sure you feel the same way because you kind of feel like...
They didn't mention the seven languages you speak.
Yeah, well, you always feel like a little bit of an imposter when you hear people talk about yourself. But I have to say, we were just talking before we started, that when we first met each other, we were in a meeting and we kind of clicked across the table with a lot of people in a very long, multi-hour meeting. And then we had an opportunity to present at the same event, and you were running in while I was, going on stage. You had to leave, and so we kind of passed in the night there. So we kind of go to separate schools together lately.
Yes. I think we just had to find a way to have this conversation.
Yeah,
so this is the best venue to do so.
Yeah, we thought the easiest thing would be get on a plane, fly across the country. So great start. Thank you so much for taking up the invitation. I think that we both sort of live in this world where we sit at the heart of lots and lots and lots of information that's changing, and there's somebody that just wants the answer, but the world is changing while we're trying to produce the answer. And there's this sort of healthy tension between having enough information to give them an answer or to give them the right answer, which might take longer than they have, right? That's got to be your world as well. That's certainly my world.
Yes. No, and the change that's taking place and taking place very quickly has essentially given new meaning to the 3 V's, right? They were always there with regard to data, analytics, and so forth. But the 3 V's being the volume, the velocity, and the veracity of data. And it's a completely new meaning now for the 3 V's. I mean, the volume is the data is just exploding, no matter what your profession. I mean, you're facing that. And velocity, again, I mean, it's a very dynamic situation. It's being generated very, very quickly. It changes very, very quickly. And because of that, there's also a lot more uncertainty with what you have to deal with. So, hence the veracity. So all 3 V's are taking on added emphasis in the new world.
One of the things I like to say about veracity is that all true information is not simultaneously true, right? So we have this tendency to bring data in that is being created somewhere else and then try to make some decisions with that data while it's changing in the place where it gets created, right? The IoT and the dark web and different challenges with this are certainly making that veracity problem take on a whole new dimension.
It's it's the biggest challenge, right? Fake news. I mean, these are all manifestations,
fake, right?
Manifestations of that of the issue.
Yeah, and that of course brings up another V, which is the variety, right? So, unstructured data is a huge part of understanding things like social listening and when new players in a particular. If you think about what just happened with United Airlines, a great example, there was a whole mode of people talking about how they felt about the apology of United Airlines, and then there was a bunch of people talking in Chinese about how they felt about the way Chinese people were treated. If you weren't listening in Chinese, you were missing that whole second dialogue.
You were missing that whole section.
Huge issue.
Yeah, no, and that's a very good point. I missed that whole section, but you probably read it in the original.
Yeah.
The point around unstructured data, I think, is a very interesting one. It never used to be the case that unstructured data was used in decision making. It was really a lot more about making use of structured data. But in terms of the volume of data that any enterprise has, about 80% is unstructured. And now we actually have the technologies, the approaches, the methodologies to make sense of that data and apply it in the context of decision making. And therein lies the opportunity of just becoming not only more accurate, but also more efficient and quicker.
I think there's also a degree of humility in that because language is constantly changing. And I don't just mean foreign languages being different from each other, but I mean within the corpus of one language, the way it's used changes constantly. And the AI, the NLP, the technologies for disambiguating language sort of trail. Think about hashtags and the term fake news. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, right? You have to chase these problems algorithmically. So when we talk about ingesting information that's unstructured, particularly language, particularly things like reviews or sentiment or very short articulations like tweets, there's a humility, I think, that we need to have, that we're always going to be chasing the edge of the curve. We don't have to be consistently right. We have to strive to get consistently wrong. As long as we know what precision is in there, I think we can deal with the technology being always a little off. It's when it's all over the place that we can't deal with it.
Yes, no, I would agree with that. I mean, I think consistency is the key, like you pointed out. And but to some extent, the technology and the volume of data, that situation helps you because, yes, your point about staying on the leading edge of all that is very difficult to do. There's no question. But a little bit on the trailing edge is a lot easier.
Yeah.
Because now you've got a tremendous volume of data.
Yeah.
And even so, terminology like fake news, people understand what it means, and even computers can understand what that means.
One of the challenges that we have is that we're looking for proper nouns, which are not in the dictionary, right? So you can't just look at a corpus of, Wikipedia, for example. You will find a number of proper nouns, not the new ones.
Yes.
Right? So that new anything, whether it's a new term or a new name for a new entity or whether it's a new type of bad behavior, that new is, I think, always going to be the little gear that drives the big gear. Totally agree that you don't have to actually outrun the bear. You just have to outrun the other campers.
The other
There
if you
is,
don't care about them.
yeah, unless you're hunting bears, right? It's a problem. Yeah, and I think it also depends on the use case.
Yes.
We were talking about the healthcare problem or challenge, whatever you want to call it. I can imagine, 5 different healthcare practitioners that all speak English as their second language, trying to describe somebody with nondescript symptoms that aren't quite easily described and using different words. And now I'm trying to use a cognitive approach to figure out what the most likely differential diagnosis is. I'm glad I don't have that problem. But you do, right?
No, that's, it's, the healthcare scenario is actually a very good one because by 2020, we expect that medical knowledge will double every 73 days. So the doctor just can't keep up.
Accessible
with the pace
knowledge, but not the knowledge in the practitioner, right?
Yes, yes. Just in terms of what's happening with journals and what's being published.
30,000 peer-reviewed journals articles a day or something like that?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the issue that you bring up is certainly there, but there's a much, almost a bigger issue in terms of keeping up with what is actually known.
Yeah.
And being able to harness that and apply that.
And even if you could, it's not all written in English anymore. More than half of it isn't.
Exactly right. Exactly. And therein, again, it goes back to the potential of having a cognitive system that allows you to harness that and address that.
Yeah.
And be able to respond adequately to that situation.
One of the places where we struggle with a cousin of that problem is looking for what we call malfeasance or bad behavior, things like fraud, identity theft, so forth. The best malfeasance, when they know they're being watched, will change their behavior. So if we only model the way we've observed them behaving, we will model how we know the best ones are no longer behaving, which is the exact opposite of what we want to be doing. So we have to look at language, we have to look at second order inference, we have to look at relationships. You're trying to find the unlikely bad disease. We're trying to find the unlikely bad actor, but they're cousins of the same problem. That the world is sort of changing while you're looking at that data. That's a tricky problem.
I mean, do you think it's all about context eventually?
I think that context is how our human brains solve it, and certainly the neuromorphic solutions will look at that as the answer. I think that we'll probably also find that there's some unlikely way of thinking about it orthogonally that hasn't occurred to us yet. For example, one of the things we look at is sparse connections in very sparse space, right? So everybody here is united by the fact that everybody here is here. That's kind of like the Professor Obvious comment, right? But there are other reasons why everybody is here. Everybody here probably speaks English. Everybody here probably has something to do with technology or knows somebody who does, right? And then I look in the back of the room and I see some people that might be here because they know some of the other people at their table, right? So is there a way of thinking about what's the common experience here to benefit the people here beyond the obvious ones? What's your resume? What's your, what did you put on your registration form? It might be that no one here ate the carrots. And maybe there's something you can learn from that, other than that people didn't want the carrots. I don't know. The carrots were very good, by the way. But,
That's a great point. I mean, there's an anecdote, if I may, that comes back to the central issue around context. This is my second go-around at IBM. About 20 years ago, I was part of their Watson Research Lab. And I ended up creating this computer program that got used by every team in the National Basketball Association. Coaches were using it to strategize for playoff games. And the lesson was brought home to me in this manner. There was a playoff series going on between Miami and Orlando, and Miami had won the 2 games. So this was an elimination game for Orlando. And the computer program essentially suggested to the coach that you should play a backup forward and a backup point guard. Now, you can imagine the reaction to that advice. Start the game playing these backup players. And eventually we solved that problem by showing them the video clips of when those circumstances occurred. And then they could figure out what was going on. So it comes back to this notion of context. So your comment about the carrots may well be applicable, but we'd need more context around it, right? I mean, this was the weakness of data mining in those days, that you could come up with very, very interesting patterns, but there was really no way that somebody who was a decision maker would trust them, especially if they were more unusual. They could just take them so much out of the realm of what they were doing.
I think what you're talking about is going to become much more of a problem as our AI agents become more autonomous. Right now, AI agents have a goal which we give them, and then they try to achieve that goal. And certainly the neuromorphic ones, the neural networks, deep believe, deep learn, we may see the answer and love the answer, but we lose the provenance of how did we get to the answer. It gets lost in the complexity of those methods, right? So now you have, imagine an autonomous car that's been given the objective of driving safely, obeying the law, and getting to the destination. And there is a certainty that in the next 4 milliseconds, I'm going to hit the car on the left or the car on the right. And I have to make a decision. I have to modify my goal and break all those rules and hit that car or that car. And I have to let that algorithm that's driving that car make that decision, because 4 milliseconds isn't enough for a human driver to intervene. We're going to have to wrestle with those problems. We're going to have to write algorithms that can rewrite their objectives. And that's a really scary world. I don't know if I love that.
I'm a little...
Especially when they're flying drones, or things like that.
Yeah, I'm a little more sanguine about that situation. I think what will end up happening is the autonomous agents will have to explain themselves, either before the fact or after the fact. Now, it's going to be a little more scary when it's after the fact.
Especially if they destroy themselves.
Yeah, because, then it's like the black box recorders. You're going to have solutions that come up that are like that. But I think while we focus on the self-driving cars and those examples, the bigger examples are actually going to be in the realm of human endeavor, in terms of keeping up with the data, in terms of establishing context, and using these agents in a way to augment that intelligence. I think that's where the explanatory aspect is going to become really critical. You can't have the agent without it being able to explain what it's presenting back to the person.
So you're using language very, very carefully, and I agree 100% with what you just said very precisely. What others might say, less precise speakers might say something like, as these AI agents learn things, we need to be able to understand what they're learning. And there's an element of anthropomorphizing these algorithms and methods. They're not learning anything. They're ingesting, they're organizing, they're connecting in ways that we've sort of arranged for them, and maybe ways that they arrange for themselves. But there is still an element of humanity in what we do with our neural networks that we're, I think, happily for me at least, a ways away from. That does leave open the possibility that they do colossally stupid things really efficiently, right? And technology can accelerate the speed with which you hit the wall, right? So
yes.
I think we still have to be a little humble about allowing goal modification, for example. I think maybe within reason.
Yes.
I think it's okay, but I think we have to be really careful. And I don't think we will, by the way. I think we will fail gloriously a few times before we slow down a little on it.
I agree with you. I think, though, this notion of these systems being able to explain themselves, the market forces will drive that, if nothing else.
Or the legal forces.
Or the legal forces, yes. And I think that's where this is eventually going to come to fruition. There will be some areas like self-driving cars, algorithmic trading and so forth, where you have to make those decisions in split seconds, and there's really no place for a human decision maker. But in all the other places, I think it's going to become much more, doctors, surgeons, so on and so forth. That's going to be just much more of an augment situation. And to your point, I mean, the question I would raise there is, does it really matter how these systems do it? Whether they're actually learning or curating and so forth. So I'll use the example of a neural network, right? So neural network, if you use it to predict something, that's one problem. That's one kind of problem. If you use it to predict and explain something, whatever it's predicting, to actually explain that, it's a much harder problem. But essentially, you can still use that same approach to solve it and to approach that much more challenging problem the same way, in the sense that you could just think of it as having more outputs for that neural network. It's a much harder problem because there are more outputs. And now you could still argue, well, is that network actually learning, what it's predicting, even if it's able to explain it? Or is it just that, you've got these two different segments of the network and that's responding in a way to the input stimuli and producing it? But if it's getting the answer right, and you're able to then act on that as a decision maker, then, it raises open that possibility. Right? Does it really matter?
Yeah, a curmudgeon would say that you just said the end justifies the means. And I know you didn't say that, because at the end, you let the human agent make the decision. So what you basically let the AI agent do was give you the best possible advice, which then you're free to accept or reject with your human brain. I think we are too quick to let our devices make decisions for us, and we're lazy. And at some point, we're going to get to the point where we take that human out of the loop of some of these
things
decisions.
we will.
And
like you pointed out.
Some people will argue, look, we're talking about something where if you wait for the human agent to make the decision, the guy dies. I get it. I don't think it's black and white. I also think that some of these scenarios will involve things that are less dispositive in the end, where we don't know that the outcome was the best. So I'm thinking of some of the government applications. What happens when we are using AI agents to make a decision about whether or not you're on the no-fly list, or whether or not the classic argument is you only have to be wrong once, right? Well, there's also a human element to that, marginalization and discrimination and bias, and sometimes these algorithms work best when they are biased, and yet there are laws against that, and there are precepts against that. So I don't think the answers are always black and white.
No, I would completely agree with you. That does raise the potential for misuse, as well as the potential for good use.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's part of the same. It's two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. There's another sort of cousin of this, which comes from the Internet of Things. So today, the Internet of Things is an Internet of Things connected to the Internet. Most of those things have an IP address. They talk back to an application. But more and more with autonomy, those things will need to have a conversation with each other and to discover each other and sort of meet each other on the street and say, hello, I'm a thermostat. What are you? Oh, I'm a fire extinguisher. Maybe you'd like to know the temperature in the room is exceeding 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Thank you. I think I'll activate, right? We imagine those conversations being very benign like that, right? But there's a dark side. And I think that we will rush to market with devices that, we need the smart refrigerator because we can't be bothered to come up with a grocery list. And apologies to anybody in the room who's working on that. Shame on us if we need our refrigerator to order our beer. But the flip side of that is we'll rush to market, and the bad guys will happily let us rush to market, and then they'll use that against us in ways that don't have names yet.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, no, they're able to, hack into devices.
They're doing it now.
Hack into locks, hack
Sure.
into, so I agree with you. I think that's the potential in terms of things moving too quickly, and then there's the possibility of misuse increases dramatically.
So I think
so
we
don't have, in a sense, regulations always lag
Yeah,
the
definitely.
technology.
Yeah.
And to some extent, you rely on the ethical behavior of practitioners to move things forward in the appropriate way. I mean, the one example that comes to mind a few years ago was the one that was very well publicized about Target, and where they were sending to a home, they were sending these advertisements for baby products, diapers and so on and so forth. And then eventually they get a call from the head of the household, the father, and he says, "Why are you doing this? And why are you addressing it to my 16-year-old daughter?" And they said, "Oh, the manager comes on, apologizes, etc." And then a few days later, he calls back and apologizes to them, saying, "Well, there were some things in my household that were going on I didn't know about." But the 16-year-old lady's privacy was violated in that whole scenario. There's no question about that, right? And if you think about what was going on there were certain market forces. So Target was aggressively marketing its products, and so it was doing this. And the only way you could have stopped that, because they didn't. It's not like they broke the law. They didn't really do anything, in terms of breaking the law.
They violated her privacy in a way that hadn't been described by the law yet.
But they were making use of all data elements that they could have used legally, and they made inferences, right? So that's the key thing about data. I mean, you end up creating more data from data. So they actually created they made an inference about this, and they acted on it. But eventually, like you point out, her privacy was violated. So if you think about it from a practical standpoint, the only place that could have been stopped was by the practitioners themselves, because there were no laws against it. So you had to have essentially a level of ethical preparedness in that team that would have said, "No, I'm not going to do this. I don't know enough about this person."
There's a line that I call the creepy line.
Yes.
Right? So, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I think that we are more and more now able to have our devices suggest when we should be going to bed. There was a recent one where they used the data from fitness monitors to figure out who woke up during an earthquake. Right? Well, I'm not sure I wanted my data about when I went to bed and whether or not I was sleeping shared with the researchers. And then someone always says, well, it was anonymized, and I think we both know that anonymizing is a term used for slowing me down and figuring out who it talks about, right?
Yes.
Yes. That's a problem. That's a very big problem, and that's going to get way worse.
It's going to get way worse.
Yeah.
And that's why I kind of, I was really asking for your thoughts on that in terms of, how could one possibly address that or get ahead of it? We've seen this repeatedly in many different scenarios. It's going to get a lot worse. There's no question about that.
I think the idea of self-regulating,
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, it's like saying, well, we will all self-regulate and behave as an orderly society, and at some level we will. But I think that commerce always trumps, to some extent, our willingness to, slow down and think about the implications of what we're doing. The IoT, I don't want to say the name of a product, but there was a child's doll that let's just call it, Arby. And there was a talk to me Arby that, the kids could talk to. And it was like Siri, only it was this doll. And the bad guys figured out that it was an IoT device with a microphone, and they could turn on the microphone when the kids weren't talking to it. And they were robbing houses and shorting stock and doing all kinds of fun things. I didn't see that coming. I'm pretty sure the people who made Arby didn't see that coming either. And then, did we make a lot of money, or did we accelerate our, press that we didn't want to get, and all these horrible things happening? So
maybe on the bad actor side, it's different. It's a different problem.
Those bad guys will always be there.
Will always be
and they are unconstrained by the law.
Yes.
And sometimes they're informed by the law to where they should go and do bad things, right?
Yes. I worry more about the inadvertent violations that could possibly occur, just because we're so far ahead of the regulations. And how do you stop that? Because in a sense, that could be a much bigger problem.
I don't think we'll ever stop it. I think it will accelerate. I think it will always accelerate. If we look at privacy, I think it's probably fairly safe to say we're both old enough to be digital immigrants and not digital natives, right? So I can remember a world with no email. My life was a lot simpler then, right? Yes. Some would argue I had problems I didn't know about because I didn't have the, wonderful communication capabilities that I have right now. And now my email can deliver spam, and it can deliver viruses, and it can deliver, all kinds of malware and horrible things. And then I don't worry about my unread email in Yahoo, and well, somebody's looking at that for something, right? Even if most of it's spam, there's data in that DAR data, right? So what are we doing? Little by little, I think we're giving up, every day we give up another little piece. And I'm not saying that's bad. It will help you diagnose, bubonic plague when it walks into an ER in a developed country where it shouldn't be, right? But it'll also help the bad guys do things that we don't have words for yet. We have to be better stewards of this.
Yes. I think there's a stewardship aspect of this that goes hand in glove with everything else. And I think, respecting the ownership of data, just common sense stuff, right? I mean, like in the case of the example I gave, I mean, there was an individual, and that was really her data, and should not have been used. So that stewardship needs to be there. It needs to be there. It needs to take hold in the market, and it needs to. I think that's the way that it'll actually move forward much more rapidly and vigorously than even through the regulation.
So if someone were here from the organization that had that algorithm that correctly, I believe it was pregnancy vitamins that they were trying to sell.
Yes.
Someone could make the argument that by helping people who are uneducated realize that when they are pregnant, they need certain vitamins that they wouldn't otherwise take, we are helping a marginalized class of people have better health care. And that is a valid argument. And then it gets taken too far.
Yes.
And we try to chase the next guy to get to her first, to sell her those vitamins to help her, right? So I think that would cross the creepy line.
Yes.
And I think that's always about this creepy line.
And you've lost the stewardship aspect of it. Because, you've
now we're just chasing revenue.
Exactly right.
Yeah, so those things probably don't start in an evil place.
No.
We just
No,
help get them there quickly.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So from your perspective, what are some of the biggest blunders that you see leading organizations that are stewards of data? So I'm going to guess that we both live in a world where we have a lot of data that people don't know we have. Lots and lots and lots and lots of data that we don't sell, that doesn't get to the outside world. It's used, the data we use to make the data, right? And I see a lot of, I'd like to make new mistakes, right? What are some of the blunders that you see besides privacy?
I think in terms of blunders in this area, around, aside from privacy, they have to do with organizational readiness to act on something around data. So, simple example: if your data is not at a certain level of veracity, nothing else really matters. All the sophisticated analytics, the cognition, anything else you do on top of that is not going to make any difference. And what I see happen quite often, is that you'll see a large organization that's going to go off and kick off a major endeavor around data or cognition exercise, but really the data is not even ready to be able to move forward with that. But you could literally spend millions and millions of dollars moving forward on something like that to no really good end result.
And what I see that as well, and I would add to that by the time, because of the lack of discipline of stopping and saying, how good does this data need to be in order for it to be in the range of usefulness for what we intend to do with it, we rush forward, and by the time you realize it, now the cost of making it right is probably 100-fold what it would have been had you addressed it at the point where it was addressable. So it's this sort of, I call it, we've got to be done by October, right? So we need to start now, right? We've got to be done by fill in the blank, right? So we need to start now. And you're trying to be the one saying, well, let's just take a minute to, well, no, now we've got one day less, right?
Yeah.
You're the speed bump.
It's that. It's also, when the objectives are laid out up front, you miss an important one. Like you said, if you start focusing just on revenue, not on stewardship, if you don't have all that stuff really laid out and you're really prepared to execute on the project,
Yeah.
it's going to lead to some blunders.
So there's a related blunder that I see in that, which is leading with the data. If someone comes to me and they say, what can you learn from this data, or can you use this data to answer this question? The answer to the first one is I can probably learn anything I want if I go in with a preconceived notion, right? And can you use this data? Maybe the answer is yes, I can, but no, I shouldn't, right? So maybe leading with a question instead of leading with the data might be a...
I agree with you. I mean, I think thinking holistically about the situation is extremely important. In fact, capturing that as part of your objectives is extremely important before you go ahead and just lead with the data. Leading with the data it comes back to that example, where if you just say, hey, play your backup players, your point guard and forward, that's just leading with the data, because you're not giving them any confidence as to why they should go off and do that. And if you act on that, it's eventually, I think the best case is that no one will use it. The worst case is that you could be terribly wrong about something.
There's another, so if I take what we're talking about and I take it to the other side, to the totally theoretical, there are some people that argue that now that the best chess-playing human has been beaten by the best chess-playing program, and now that the best AlphaGo, the best Go player has been beaten by a program, and the best trivia expert has lost to some cognitive thing. I can't remember what it was called. Just kidding. It's all over. Computers are smarter than us. No, they're better at us than playing Jeopardy, and they're better at us than playing chess, and they're better at us than playing Go, and those are three very bespoke technologies, or at least in 2 of the 3 cases, bespoke technologies that were used for a very specific purpose, and now we get to use our human brains to go solve bigger problems or better problems. So I don't think we should give up on the fact that the computers are smarter than us. I don't think they are. I think they're faster and more efficient at certain things.
I think what leads to that view that they are smarter is when you look at those same examples that you talked about. There's another example in that vein that has to do with playing video games. And now you literally have computers that the only input they use to start learning about how to play these games are just the pixels. So it's down to that level. And then they're able to, with just some periodic input in terms of whether they're right or wrong, get to a stage where they're actually able to beat humans. So in at least in a narrowly defined context, we know that computers can get there. And then when you couple that with the IoT scenario that you painted, that's where people start thinking about the more dire scenarios of computers being smarter than people. But I agree with you that it's far from that, and it's also much more a situation about augmenting intelligence as it is about completely autonomous intelligence. Although there will be situations where there is autonomous intelligence.
So autonomous intelligence as opposed to autonomous synthesis of information to achieve an outcome or a task. I think those are 2 different things, right? So
yes.
Will a computer ever get to the point where the auto flight system doesn't need to give the plane back to the pilot, right? Even in turbulence, even in bad weather, even when there's a malfunction, even when all of the, I don't know, maybe, I hope not, maybe. But that still doesn't mean that thing that's autonomous is intelligent. And I know we're getting to a Turing test
Yes.
problem here. At what point does it trick me to
Does it
believing
become-
that it's,
yes.
But I think that there's still some hope for the fact that we will continue to think about the problem in a new way. And maybe some of this autonomy gives us the autonomy, if you will, to go off, and while I don't have to be worrying about, the ACLS protocol for cardiac care, I can think about, what commonality am I seeing in the last 5 patients that came in here with a heart problem?
And using that,
using that
which
in a new
otherwise you would
way.
not notice.
Because I'm too busy.
Yes,
prescribing
too
drugs.
busy doing other things.
Right.
That's why I made that point earlier, that we focus a bit too much on the self-driving cars and those scenarios, while the vast majority of scenarios are really about augmenting intelligence and the benefits that accrue from that, which is the positive side of the equation.
So I think we only have a few more minutes. I'd like to ask you a question about the future. Both of us are in a position, I think, where we have a responsibility to leave the job a little better than we found it, a job that maybe didn't exist when we took it.
Yes.
Right? One of the things that I have often said is that the skills that have made any of us successful so far are table stakes. And we need to develop new skills. So that means that we don't just hire the best and the brightest. We've got to look at the people in the organization and make sure that they're upping their game constantly too. What other advice would you give to leaders in data functions, data-based functions?
So, I mean, the way I envision the near future for us is in a large enterprise, you would have a subject matter expert, somebody who understands their domain, whether it be banking or finance, or their process, whether it be procurement or human relations or something like that. That they're able to step up to a curtain, and then behind the curtain is this really intelligent system. And they're able to rapidly, they'll obviously come in with a use case in mind. So these are not technologists, not mathematicians, not computer scientists, but they're just subject matter experts, people who do their everyday jobs. There are literally thousands of those people in any large enterprise. And they're able to essentially start interacting with a really intelligent system to identify what sources of data exist within the company, outside the company, that's relevant to the use case that they have. And then it's able to help them relate that data set, those data sets in a way that, okay, these are the key concepts that apply. And then finally work with them to arrive at insight that helps them do a better job, make a better decision. You might think that this is, in some sense, simple, but it has very, very far-reaching consequences. And there are some incredibly simple examples that I can think of, just within my own realm of experience. The people, and you guys work with this as well. I mean, we make judgments on whether we are dealing with a government-owned entity because there are global regulations as to how you should deal with them.
And yet you can't keep a list of the entities.
You can't keep a list of the entities. They're changing, et cetera, et cetera. And it's also, and there are also forces that kind of, could sway you one way or the other. The sales guys look at it one way. The legal guys look at it another way.
The government guys look at it.
The government guys look at it another way. The data guys look at it another way. An incredible amount of escalation and so forth that has to happen. If you then think in terms of this intelligent system, actually not only keeping a record of the history and when the information was, when the classification was right or wrong, but also look at the real-time information that's flowing in, not just something obvious like the government acquired this company, so it's a government-owned entity, but something like the founder of this company is now on a high-ranking government committee. And these systems are able to come up with that subtlety. You essentially have the opportunity now to make a much better and informed decision, much more efficiently, since you don't have the escalations. Everybody's dealing with this system. So, to come back to your question, with regard to business leaders, we've got to have people who are comfortable in situations like that as it changes and moves forward. They're comfortable working with
abstract
these intelligent systems, and they're comfortable getting input from these systems that could take various forms because they're going through all types of unstructured data, many different kinds, synthesizing it, putting it together, making judgments, and then acting on it.
So the one thing I definitely hear where you're coming from there. I can also see if we're not careful, we get lazy and we say, well, it must be because the machine said so, right? And we miss using your government-owned entity example as a very real problem. There are parts of the world where it's illegal to keep any information on government-owned entities, and therefore you can't know which are the entities you're not allowed to keep any information on. So it's the Kobayashi Maru.
Yes.
I know I'm in a room that can laugh at that. You know who you are, right? So that's a huge sort of syllogism, right? You can't know what you're not supposed to know, and therefore don't know it. And I think that the answer to that is called leadership, right? All right, how are we going to measure this? How are we going to unlearn? How are we going to redact if we collect this information? How are we going to learn what we did wrong so we make new mistakes? That is a new kind of thinking, and it's a very humble kind of thinking for a leader to work from the presumption that I am going to make mistakes and I'm going to learn from those, as opposed to I know all the answers and I'm going to correct those who are wrong. Right? Big difference.
It's a learning paradigm.
Huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely.
Taking yourself out of the center of that.
And it also the fundamental problem of just there being a lot more uncertainty.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot more data. And dealing with that, I think it's going to force that humility.
So one of the new normals here is that no system in the world can consume all the data we're producing.
Yes.
Most of the data we're producing is unstructured, and we're adequate at best in dealing with it. So this sort of concept of being overwhelmed by the data is the new normal, and that shouldn't stop us from thinking about the next big thing that we can go and tackle while we're overwhelmed by all that data, right?
Yes, I mean, I think the machines were going to help us deal with that mass of data, but we're still going to be it's all about augmented intelligence. I do think the points that we raised earlier in terms of having the stewardship aspect go hand in glove with whatever you're doing is critical to people like us, really. I mean, otherwise, may not end up in the right place.
So I think we have some time for Q&A. If there's anybody in the room that would like to ask a question, I see someone in the corner over there waving.
Hey, hi. I'm Shaunak. I'm a co-founder of a still in stealth AI startup. We are focused on wealth management, and our AI is currently used at Vanguard and a bunch of other places. Our core focus is on reasoning, so it was good to have you converse on that in the early part of the conversation. My question is to your point around autonomous agents making decisions and explaining themselves. Do you believe that reasoning, which is not exactly a faculty of computer science, but of epistemology, do you think that needs to be inbuilt into the AI's neural network, like literally the underlying math in the neural network? And a follow-up on that, on a more abstract note, do you think that decisions, regardless of how they're used, whether in an autonomous environment or in an augmented environment, do you think that it is the algorithms that are biased or the data that goes in the neural network that is biased?
I have...
Go ahead.
So I think we might have different answers on this. In terms of the epistemology being codified into the agents, we actually do that. So I'm not going to say we do it perfectly, because epistemology is an inherently squishy kind of subject. It's really unfortunate to use a big word like autonomy and epistemology and then go squishy, but it's an imprecise kind of thing. But there are ways of sort of getting to that. One of them is propositional calculus. Another one is to use heuristics. So we do some degree of that to the extent that I believe is possible. The second part of your question about bias being in the algorithms or being in the data, I don't think data inherently contains any bias. There can be data that's incomplete, improperly sampled, that can inherently, the missing MH370 plane right now, there's 7 different data arcs where the analysts are putting the plane. So some people will say, well, 6/7 of that data is wrong. The data is what the data is. 6/7 of the analysis might be wrong, but it's the analysis that generally imparts the bias, with the exception of the sort of statistical bias that comes from having the wrong data. And I think you're going to disagree with me on the first one and agree with me on the second one.
Oh, no, actually, I mean, I'm in maybe not in wholehearted agreement, but at least.
So you agree that we?
Yeah, no, I agree.
Disagree.
I think it's more in the method. I mean, whether it's baked into the neural network or not. I mean, there has to be, and what I'm going to say is, I'm going to put it a little differently. The system has to be able to explain itself. So you have to have some level of, whether you call it reasoning or something else that's captured there, so that it's able to then essentially articulate why it arrived at the recommendation that it did, what were the other options that it considered, and why did it favor one over the other. So whether you build it as part of the neural network itself or the algorithm itself, or whether it's baked into the system in some other way, you do have to do that. I mean, that's kind of, from a practitioner standpoint, that's how I would look at that. With regard to the data being biased or the algorithms being biased, I think there's possibility of both being biased if you don't do them right, and you could end up reaching decisions that are biased for that reason. And we see that play out in many different arenas. It's only from a theoretical sense, if you were to have complete data about a situation, that you could come up with with an unbiased starting point. But that's never practical. You're always going to have some snapshot, some segment. You'll miss some aspect of the data. So you're going to deal in a situation that's somewhat biased. You could also use the algorithm to actually correct that bias. So you could play it both ways.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
There's, I think, a good example. One of the problems that we're working on in my group right now has to do with geofencing. When you take a point and then you draw a circle around that point, and you look at everything that's in that circle. Usually what you do is you draw a square around the circle, and you look in the square, because of latitude and longitude make that easier. It turns out that we all know the Earth is not really a perfect sphere. It's kind of squashed, and that square gets distorted because of the squashed nature of the Earth, but we've just ignored that in almost everything we do in geofencing. Everybody has ignored it because we say, well, it's not that much. The Earth is pretty close to spherical. Turns out that if you take a city block at the equator and move it up to the North Pole, you distort it by about 12%, which is a lot of bias, east-west over north-south, when you're ignoring it. And so for a very long, thin place that's oriented north-south, like Japan or Florida, it turns out that it matters. And so now we're in the process of looking back at some of our algorithms that ignored that problem to see how far off they are and whether or not we would have come up with a different answer in certain cases. And surprisingly, we're finding some interesting analogies. So, is that bias in the data? No, it's in the fact that everybody just ignored something that they knew to be true because they figured it wasn't that important, and the math to figure it out was right there. It's not new math. It's, non-Euclidean geometry. It's been around since Euclid. So, well, that one got a big laugh. Are there any other questions?
Follow that. Right. Hi, I'm
Does this have
David
anything to do
McCulloch.
with Euclid, by the way.
No, it has to do with MH370, though, funnily enough.
Excellent.
You described some case studies that are about applying big data to solving little problems at a human level, perhaps. Who's got a certain disease, dementia, bubonic plague, but it's just one life. Then there are the examples of MH370, where we'd probably really like to know the moment that critical systems started to be shut down, somebody was going way out of the scope of normal pilot behavior. And I'm curious, from a commercial perspective at IBM, are you seeing customers more interested in solving lots of small incremental problems, or those catastrophic moments, that person we shouldn't let into the country because they're the terrorist, or that pilot that's doing something that will bring the plane down? How does that show up in terms of commercialization of your data solution?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to talk to that point, just alluding back to the basis that we said in the earlier conversation, right? So we talked about using a lot more unstructured data, as well as a lot of exogenous data. So if you turn back the clock, a few years back, the way data science proceeded is you would get the data that you thought you would need to solve the problem. You would create models, then you would apply it. You would kind of score situations as they came in, and you would apply it, right? And in a sense, it's a closed loop event. With these newer approaches and systems, and especially with the application of exogenous data and a lot of unstructured data, you essentially have systems that are open loop. That example I gave about picking up on the fact that this executive is now on a high-ranking government committee, doing that in real time and then applying that. It makes it an open loop system, which means that there's the possibility of actually avoiding those black swan events that brought hedge funds down and so on and so forth. And so I mean, the short answer to your question is both. I mean, people are realizing that there is now this potential, and so you can try to avoid these catastrophic events by applying, this kind of an approach, which is much more open loop than what we had in the past. But there's still, there's still the application to the closed loop systems as well to make them much more accurate by bringing in more data and perhaps even more important, more context, right? I mean, the example I gave about the NBA, I mean, now the systems that are available can actually go to video, can gauge distances between players, do all this stuff automatically, and you can now see a way to come back with a pattern that would be far more compelling.
I could also add that in our space, our customers in the days of old were very interested in just making an individual credit decision or selling to somebody, and now, I've been with the company for 15 years. The majority of the conversations I'm in are about the integrated supply chain, or in our government space, bad actors and who might be funding them, for example, or it might be in a context of understanding shifts in behavior in the context of new markets or new opportunities. So those are all those macro problems. And I think that embedded in your question is sort of the suggestion that it's either this or that. And I think embedded in your answer was it's this and that.
It's this and that.
So probably not the answer you were looking for, but.
Well, I was asking about where the money is.
Well, and it's an interesting question. So where the money is in terms of selling things, or where the money is in terms of, understanding what's happening. If you look at corporate social responsibility, a curmudgeon could say, well, there's no money in that. I would say think again, right? So the altruist in me wants companies to be socially responsible. The pragmatist in me says lots of people will pay for figuring out which ones are, right? Hi. Question?
Tony Emerson with Microsoft. I have maybe a fairly simple but a complex question. What amount of time do you think we should spend with, either call it AI, machine learning, whatever, looking for bad things as opposed to good things? We spend a lot of time today finding the right thing to market to someone when maybe they're pregnant, which you mentioned earlier, but maybe we should spend a lot more time rooting out, I don't want to say evil, but things that are not perhaps quite as kosher. And what's the right balance between those two?
I don't know that there's a numerical answer to that. I would say that the right answer starts with asking that question. I think there's always an opportunity cost, right? So someone could argue that for a resource-constrained environment, and Microsoft is everyone is resource-constrained at some level, if everybody runs to this side of the boat, nobody's paying attention to that side of the boat, right? So part of my answer would be that there needs to always be a healthy balance there. And then I would look at, problem formulation. So you can't try to solve a problem like terrorism. It's too big. It's just too big. But if you asked yourself the question, can we realistically make a difference in airport security? That's not enough. That might be enough commercially, because the airports or the agencies that pay for it might be willing to buy that. But someone could say, well, wait a minute, they're probably secure enough, and if you went after, fill in the blank, that employee screening for the baggage handlers, that you'd make more of an impact on the bad thing than. So I think that we have to be bigger at problem formulation than just, are we going to make any money at it? I'm not suggesting you were saying that, but some think this way, that what's the higher order problem, and how much of it is over on this good side and how much of it is over on this bad side is part of that mix. Opportunity cost is part of that mix. And certainly, as leaders in the organization, if I see the critical mass shifting all the way over there and I didn't put it there, I better be able to explain why. So is that 50-50?
No, I agree with you. I guess what I was trying to get at is that for all of this quote good that we can drive out of it, we should be setting aside something maybe to root out the bad.
I will tell you that my mind share probably spends more time thinking about the bad actors because they're more unpredictable and they're more nefarious in terms of changing their behavior. So the technologies and the approaches to go after them are probably more challenging, and to me, I think there's a danger in ignoring that. Commercially, it's probably the other way.
I think, the dark web is a good example of that, right? I mean, and there's a lot of focus now, if you look at from the standpoint of security products and so forth, there's a lot of focus on actually looking at the dark web. So then it brings you to a situation where you're able to predict what the actors are about to do, as opposed to waiting till they're actually attacking the site or doing something like that, right? So I would say that there is a focus on, on what you described. I think, again, it has to do with the market opportunity, though. That's kind of what's driving that. From my standpoint, I mean, just philosophically, I think there is value when you look at a particular problem to look at it holistically and to frame the objective holistically, which kind of covers both aspects, so that you find the right balance. For instance, putting the stewardship objective as part of a larger objective and making sure that's baked in. I mean, I think that's not only going to arrive at a better solution. I also think it's competitively differentiating. It's just the right thing to do in multiple dimensions. It's harder because you have more objectives to go after, but essentially eventually leads you to the better place. So I think it's another way of making Anthony's point, that if you look at the objective holistically and if you look at it broadly, you're probably going to end up in a better place than focusing just on the going after the good or the bad.
I realize I didn't look this far over. Are there any other questions in the marginalized section of the room here? Sorry. The orthographically marginalized. Oh, I'm sorry.
The powers with the
Perhaps the gentleman with the microphone has a question.
Well, it gets even odder. I'm probably the second Shaunak in 100 miles around here, and that's what the carrots meant. 2 Shaunaks in the room, and they both ask a question. So my question really was...
That is fascinating.
So the question I had was with the impact of machines taking decision based on data which was created when humans took those decisions. Yeah. So let me take a very mundane example that you have, self-driving cars. They are being trained when all the people on the road, or most of the people on the road, are humans. Now, let's extrapolate and say suddenly, these self-driving cars come in and everyone has a Tesla and everyone is in a self-driving car. So this is a mundane example with self-driving cars, but there could be situations in other places like, health, et cetera, where maybe because these machines are taking the decision, the value of the data which they're taking the decision on might not have the same impact. You see what I'm getting at?
I think I do.
So, I think your point is well taken in the sense that if you're making use of data that in some sense is based on a very different situation and context than what you have, you would obviously get suboptimal results while doing that. And then you could argue that, well, the system is going to learn as there are more self-driving cars and so forth. I would say, though, that what's likely, to also happen is the entire system changes, right? So if you have a predominance of self-driving cars, the next thing to streamline that whole equation may be, smarter roads that are communicating with the cars as they go by. Perhaps the cars are communicating with each other as well. So there's always going to be that change, and I don't think that we usually end up in a situation where obviously for some time we might be using the data that's available, but as the new data gets available, because it's a very dynamic world that we're talking about, then that makes it just completely different in terms of the kinds of analyses that you would do. So, I think that would be the larger point that I would make, that I would expect that whole context to change.
There are a couple of things that I would add as sort of things to think about. I think it's well known that there's people messing with the self-driving cars right now. So like kids make fake stop signs and they stand in the middle of an intersection and hold them up, and the self-driving cars stop, right? And you know, a human driver would just laugh at the kid with the fake stop sign, but now we have to teach the self-driving cars to look for fake stop signs, which is a little scary because, you know, and that's just one of many examples where the environment itself changes because the environment is changing, right? I have a nephew who is an engineer, and I had a conversation with him one time about whether or not he knew how to calculate a square root. And he said, well, I use my calculator. And I said, what if you didn't have a calculator? And he said, everything has a calculator. And I said, well, what if you're on a desert island? And he said, then why do I need a square root? So, you know, we're going to always be faced with the fact that the environment changes itself, right? And I think that as long as the agents that are learning are smart enough to learn from the environment and not from what we think the environment is, we'll probably be okay. But at the same time, I think our human brains will always be a little better than our algorithmic agents. And therein lies opportunity for bad behavior. Therein lies opportunity for product evolution. Therein lies opportunity for change and all of that, right?
And I think just to comment on something you had said earlier, Anthony, in terms of, you know, what would you tell the business leaders in terms of employees and, you know, what they should be ready for? It's change, actually. I mean, I think it goes to that point that we just made. I think that's where intrinsically, you know, humans could be one step ahead of what's happening, because as the environment changes and so forth, they're devising, you know, different approaches to that. And I think it just becomes something that has to become part of our DNA, like, rather than just staying on these stable situations, but it's going to be a much more dynamic and changing situation. And you know, I like to describe my job as just two words: change agent. And I think that's pretty much the way it's going to become for, you know, every job, really.
So change agent can be taken two ways, right? So you're an agent of change, or you're changing the agent, right?
I don't speak seven
in your
languages,
job.
I told you
no,
that.
but in your job, right, I think that the environment changes you as well. I would suggest that you are working with technologies that are forcing you to change.
Yes.
While you're changing your organization to deal with those technologies.
Yes.
That's a huge problem, and a huge challenge, and a huge opportunity, and a tough job, right? Yeah. So, yes.
I have a question just on this.
I think we might need you to use the microphone. Do you require the microphone for the, yes. Would you like to imagine you had a microphone and just think the question at me? Sorry. Yeah,
Thank you.
that's right.
So that was an interesting discussion. My question then is, where does education go to prepare us for that world?
Yeah.
You know, what do we need as societies
Yeah.
to build as the next education to make human beings successful in this challenging world?
So as part of my job, I spend a lot of time with universities that are building data science programs, that are building problem formulation courses and so forth. And the big question is not only what do we teach them today, but what do we teach them today that will be relevant when they graduate, when things are changing so fast. And one of the things I say is, if I look at the program and I see you teaching the tools of data science, you know, I don't want to start listing a bunch of products, but you know, we all know what they are, right? Those environments and those tools are necessary but not sufficient, and they will probably change by the time those kids graduate. So they need something, because you have to be able to work with data, but that is not data science, right? Data science is thinking like a scientist, understanding the environment, asking a good question, picking a method because it's the best method, not the one you know, not just using an open source tool, understanding what the preconditions might be in order to use it. Those kinds of things are things we need to be teaching to make the practitioners of tomorrow able to handle that pace of change.
I think, no, it's you know, it's an excellent question. It's a really important problem. It obviously has national impact, societal impact. I think, you know, in the context of the workplace too, it has a tremendous implication, because to scale, you need people who are able to adapt to change and able to work with the newer systems and so forth. And I think retraining within the context of the workplace has to receive a much bigger emphasis, than it has in the past to be able to pull that off. And I mean, within my shop alone and the work that I do, we have a large number of people who are essentially working on the data processes in the way that they always have been. And we're also disrupting and transforming those processes. But largely, to be able to scale across a large organization like that, you can't say, I'm going to bring in 800 new people. You really have to take the people who are doing that work and retrain them to be able to pull this off with a fraction of the people that you would want to bring in as new. And that's a challenge. I mean, I think that's what Anthony was alluding to in terms of transformation on the fly. But I think the emphasis there on retraining within the work context is going to be extremely important.
Do we have any other questions? Yes.
You know where I'm coming from. My focus is on helping business leaders, your phrase, create new markets. So I'm following up a question with you. How, in a crisp way, would you counsel business leaders to be good stewards with everything you've just been discussing?
What was the last part of the question?
Within the context of this discussion.
Within the context of this discussion, how would you counsel business leaders, not technicians, business leaders, to be good stewards of their business?
I would, in a crisp way, right? So, I mean, what I like to say, it's like your data is your data. If it's your data, it's your insight. And so if we are to respect that, then that's going to lead us to the right place in terms of stewardship. And that's something that I think it behooves us to put forward to all our customers, whoever they may be. And if you start with that starting point, I think it's going to end up in the right place with regard to what you do with regard to your products. That's got to be baked into the into the commercial motives, the profit motives, and all that stuff. That's why I was talking about having a much more holistic view in terms of what you do.
If I could just add to that, in terms of stewardship, I think as leaders in organizations today, the question of stewardship is really one of self-examination, of understanding why you're doing what you're doing. So we spent a lot of time in decades past talking about mission and vision and values and so forth, and everybody's been to a conference room called the customer conference room or the focus conference room. But really, why do your actions equate with what you say you believe? And now we have the data to prove it. So if we look at what you say you stand for and what you do, and there's a disparity there, then I would question whether your stewardship is driven by the right motivation. So I think stewardship is about understanding why you do what you do as much as it is about what you do. And I think that we could use a lot more of that introspection. The epistemology question comes to mind, right? So, are we doing it because we're going to make another dollar, or are we going to do it because it's going to move things in the right direction in terms of that balance between good and not so good? I think those are very, very important questions, well within the grasp of anybody here as leaders in organizations, which is everybody here. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, thanks.
And actually two, because this gentleman has been trying to ask a question for 5 questions. So,
Hi, thanks for the thought-provoking discussion here. My question is about the societal impact. You gave some examples where computers are already way ahead of human capability, and it's not inconceivable to think that that capability will continue to increase and perhaps exponentially. Juxtapose that with population growth that is $10 billion inhabitants of this planet. It's not inconceivable. You can imagine that a certain or broad category of jobs would no longer be there, and you might have to have certain set of individuals just not gainfully employed. Who should think about these, and how do you? And there is some thoughts out there that some displaced individuals should be paid stipend to just stay at home because computers can do it cheaper, better, faster.
Yeah.
Who should think about this?
We'll pay you not to work so you don't mess things up, right? So, good luck with that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's that's a view that you could look at it that way. I mean, what's more likely to happen though is the nature of the job itself changes, right? I mean, even that very simple example I made about somebody who's not going to be somebody at a high level, right? Somebody doing a fairly low level job, trying to reach this classification on government-owned entities. That job is going to change in the way it's going to be done, but there's still somebody who's going to have to make that call. And so I think you'll find that there's probably a lot more of that than the case where it's just a simple, complete, the computers take over and they do the job. There'll be a lot, there is a lot of that too. I mean, there's no question about that. But I think at the same time, it's the other question that was asked with regard to societal impact. If you have to prepare the population, the workforce population, to be able to embrace that change in the form of whatever the job represents in the future. And I think with regard to the question on, what do you do with people who have actually lost jobs? Certainly, I mean, solutions have to be reached there. That's otherwise, in the instances where you've got a whole segment of jobs essentially displaced, that happens every time there's a change, right? I mean, it happened with the steam engine. It happens with every time there's a major change in technology. There's a major advance in technology. And what I would hope is that we would be coming up with better and better solutions to address that as we move forward. I mean, I don't see that as being that much different from any other major sea change of technology that we've had as we move forward. And I think the point about the augmented job in terms of being different is probably one that's that's underappreciated as we move forward with this.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk of late about how the number one job that will be impacted most quickly and most egregiously is driving things. That there's so many jobs that involve people driving things, and we've already all checked off like all the issues that exist, and we're assuming that all the driving jobs are going to go away tomorrow. I think this is closer, and I'm not trying to be insensitive to that the unskilled work or the less skilled work will suffer more, but it's not the first time the human race has seen this. We've had the Industrial Revolution. We've had the shift from non-solid state technology to solid state technology. There were people who knew how to do stuff that became irrelevant before. It's not the first time that that's happened. Not to sound overly altruistic, but I hope that we use some of our excess human capacity to solve some of the problems that we haven't come close to addressing yet. I think there's some great opportunity there. I think that people who are involved in public policy are all over this question. I'm not worried about reporting to an AI agent someday because Outlook tells me what to do today, right? So I think it's just a question of how much of that we allow and to the extent of training people to do meaningful things that actually have impact. There's a very patient gentleman over here that gets the last question.
Sure.
Make it a good one.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. I'm Ray Sika from Sensitel and Persistent Space. So my question is that for better or for worse, last decade actually has been made by the cookie. And by that, what I mean is it's the web tracking on the web, which basically drove the data creation. Like largest data was created by Google, Facebooks of the world, and it's all about advertisement. The smartest people of my generation, my school, they're all basically serving ads, right? So now we have another opportunity to connect these things to the internet. So we have another opportunity to do it actually. So do you think we'll do it differently this time? And so my question is actually, if cookie was about web pages, what is going to be the analog in the things?
Yeah.
And what should the smart people of next 10 years be doing?
This time I'll give you the pleasure.
So I think cookie is to web browsing as data exhaust is to IoT. All of those IoT devices, at least as we envision them today, are bespoke devices that do a thing for a purpose, and they produce some sort of data which is used for that purpose and then thrown away. What happens if we don't throw it away? What happens if we use it to learn? And there's not a name for that yet, right? So it's a device cookie. It's like a dookie, right? That using that data for something other than that which it was intended for will probably have some huge value and huge monetization that we don't understand yet. That's my prediction.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I mean, I think with the IoT revolution, it's almost a little more natural that data, in fact, I would say it won't be treated as exhaust, because it will be actually exchanged between devices and it will be stored. And because people will realize the value of that, much sooner than we did in the previous case. And I think it'll be, that data will be available. Now, exactly in what form that will be, that standardization is not there yet. And I think that'll be worked out by those who are early in the game. So
I don't think it'll be standardized, by the way.
They may not be standardized.
Because the proliferation of devices will force a constant change in ontology, which will force us to stop being so focused on standardizing things. And then once we do that, we really unhinge the whole thing. Great. All right.
On that note.
I'd like to thank Anthony and Inderpal for sharing your perspectives so generously with us. Thank you so very much. Maybe we should invite them back in a couple of years to see how things have changed, right?
Thank you.
So as a small gesture of our thanks, we have for you the Churchill Club speaker T-shirt.
The coveted
speaker T-shirt. We hope you wear that in good health. A recording of this program will be available on the Churchill Club YouTube channel within a couple of days, and we hope you will find that to be a useful resource. And you have been a very wonderful audience. We'd like to especially thank Dun & Bradstreet and Citrix again. Have a great evening. Good night.